So thanks very much, Dr. Hanson, for joining us today. Let's start with one very basic question is, are you the first scholar to coin the term Neurodharma? And how does it differ from or build on recent research and publications about meditation's ability to shape the brain?
I think I'm probably the first person to use that term. And the way I think of it is in a practical frame. In other words, if we were to naturalize the Dharma, if we were to ground it in life, in other words, if we were to consider the mental causes of suffering and the mental causes of the end of suffering, which is, of course, the focus of the Buddha. It's a pragmatic focus. If we were to consider those causes in terms of the underlying neurobiological causes of those mental causes, how might that be useful? So for me, the idea of Neurodharma is a practical one. It's the idea of grounding practice in life and seeing what value that might give to us. It's not for me a reductionistic one. It's not to say that all of the Dharma can be neurologized, but more to investigate how it might be beneficial to naturalize, to bring into a natural frame some important Buddhist themes such as tanha or craving, desire, or tranquility or mindfulness or loving kindness, for example. I think it's useful from a practical standpoint to understand something of those important themes in terms of the underlying nature of the body itself.
So Neurodharma is, from your perspective, one part of Dharma, like one important component, but a component nevertheless.
That's right. It is an emerging piece. I mean, when the Buddha taught, of course, and became enlightened himself, and then taught others to become enlightened, and also to, if not enlightened, move very far along in practice, he obviously knew nothing about an MRI or an EEG, and still his methods are obviously very effective. My interest is, what do we do now that we know increasingly what the underlying neural, physical, biological processes are that underlie the aggregates, for example, that underlie desire or suffering, that underlie loving kindness or equanimity. When we know more and more what's happening inside the brain, when we are at peace, what shall we do with that knowledge? Okay? And I think it's very useful, actually, to bring to bear for practice. And we're just at the beginning of that. We're in the first 10 or 20 years, Buddhism has been here for 2,500 years. I'm convinced it'll be here for at least 2,500 years more, if not...
That would be very good.
If not a lot longer. Bows to the truth is the truth lasts. But for me, what's interesting is to use the neuroscience, which is a baby science, to begin to see what might be effective for personal practice.
You have 3 insights that you're discussing in your presentation at this conference. And the first insight is that wholesome mental states build up wholesome brain structures, and unwholesome mental states correspondingly build up unwholesome brain structures. And my question would be, do these mental states correspond with what the Buddhist scriptures have traditionally described as wholesome, unwholesome?
The short answer is yes. The longer answer is a little more complicated, so in 2 parts. The first part is the idea from neuropsychology called experience-dependent neuroplasticity. In other words, it's the fundamental idea that the brain, comprised of 1.1 trillion cells, about 100 billion neurons, is constantly changing its structure based on the flows of information moving through it. So in neuroscience, the nervous system is considered to be an information processing system. And the term mind, or similar related words like mental or psychological, refer to information inside the frame of neuroscience. There is no reference to anything transcendental or supernatural or metaphysical or mystical. In other words, the nervous system of a mouse processes information, much like the nervous system of a human being processes information. Our nervous system is just vastly more complex, obviously, so we can process vastly more complex information, like talking about these subjects here today. So in this context, then, our experiences are continually changing the brain. That's how we learn. Any kind of learning, any kind of positive growth, or any kind of change for the worse psychologically, in terms of suffering, must correspond to some kind of underlying change in neural structure. The details of that change are still they're not known well. I mean, neuroscience is a baby science. But it's increasingly clear in many, many kinds of areas that learning changes the brain. Now, some kinds of learning, Buddhist growth, if you think of the path of practice as a progressive process of learning, that must therefore change the brain. So the wholesome mental states of various kinds that the Buddha spoke to, for example, the factors of awakening, let's say tranquility or investigation or rapture, bliss, or equanimity, or mindfulness, and so forth. As those wholesome mental states get stronger in someone, inside the natural frame of investigation, which is the frame of modern science, that therefore means that something has to change for the better in the brain, right? Now, it's possible, certainly, that certain sophisticated mental states are in different traditions, such as Tibetan Buddhism, do not yet map well to some kind of underlying psychological, neuropsychological understanding, on the one hand. On the other hand, many of the fundamental ideas in the Pali Canon, the earliest surviving teachings of the Buddha, basic ideas like the Vedanas, the feeling tones, or concentration, or rapture, or joy, or tranquility, or tanha, craving, desire, or aversion, or grasping, those correspond quite well to underlying those wholesome and unwholesome states, correspond quite clearly to underlying neuropsychological processes. The details, I think, are going to be investigated over the next 100 or 200 or 1,000 years. But in broad outline, the dots are increasingly connecting between the mental states and the underlying neural activity.
Then we go to the point that recent research admits that shaping the brain is fairly difficult. It takes time. It's a gradual process over many years, if not decades. It's as difficult as, traditional meditation, is it not? And so with this in mind, how do we take Neurodharma beyond the laboratory or academia into the lives of everyday people?
Actually, I would not accept the premise of the question. And what I mean by that is that if you remember what you had for breakfast, your brain was shaped differently. It was not hard to shape your brain in that way. If you learned something new, a new idea today or a new word today, your brain therefore must be shaped. So some changes are fairly easy to accomplish. There's a particular and very important problem here because negative experiences are very effective in shaping the brain. We learn very rapidly from pain because rule number one in the wild, if you think about animals evolving, is eat lunch today, don't be lunch today. In other words, if you have pain, you need to remember forever how to avoid it in the future. So we have a brain that's actually learns too quickly from pain. It helped our animal ancestors survive, but today it creates a lot of needless stress and a lot of needless suffering and a lot of needless contraction to avoid ever risking that kind of pain again. So the other thing to say is that research also shows that much like the way in which people can learn fairly quickly, important things like avoiding a red light, or not interrupting your mate when you're having a conversation about something that he or she is upset about. We can learn these things fairly quickly. It's also true that we can learn certain Dharma points fairly quickly. I remember when I first came to the Dharma in 1974, and I read some Zen teachings about how everything changes and everything is connected to everything else. That sank home right there. On the other hand, you're exactly right. The kind of long, slow change in practice and the long, slow process of becoming awakened is a very, very long process and obviously needs a lot of work. So I think the summary point I would make is, on the one hand, studies show that a little bit of practice over just a few weeks can actually produce measurable changes in the brain that correspond to the person's experience of becoming more relaxed and less grasping and less harmful to other people. On the other hand, to get the kind of radical changes in the brain, or the radical changes in one's life that the Buddha talked about. That is a long process. And there is also much research that shows that people who have many thousands of hours of meditative practice have substantially different brain activity compared to people who are beginning or intermediate meditators. So I guess my summary point is a little bit helps. Have faith. Conviction is one of the spiritual powers. On the other hand, realize that if you want to get the results, you have to do the work. It's a little bit like building a muscle. If you want to make your muscle a little bigger, all right, do a little bit of work. But if you really want to develop that muscle, you have to do a lot of practice over a long period of time. But you can have confidence that your efforts will bear fruit eventually. And I think that's a wonderful thing.
And you mentioned two words that struck me in particular in your presentation as disenchantment, about the reality of anatta, or selflessness, and disidentifying from unwholesome states. And so in our modern, I'd say general culture, we tend to assume even the words themselves, disenchantment, right, disillusionment, they are used in very negative contexts. I am disillusioned with my divorce. I'm disillusioned with my job or something like that. But for the Buddhist mind, it's disenchantment and disillusionment sounds very good. That at least that's the basic idea. So, could you elaborate a little bit about that?
Yes. Well, the Pali word, that's the language of the earliest earliest surviving Buddhist teachings. The Pali word that's often used is nibbida, and it is sometimes translated as disgust, which is a step beyond mere disenchantment. I think, like many scholars, that disenchantment in English is a better translation. It's waking up from the spell, waking up from the enchantment, including the everyday enchantment that we evolved to believe, which is that we're always a little threatened, we're always a little frustrated, and we're always a little lonely, even when actually there's no danger, we have all that we need, and other people love us. That is a kind of delusion that helps animals survive. But for serious Dharma practice, we need to wake up from, in effect, the well-intended nightmare that Mother Nature evolved in our brains to help our animal ancestors survive. So I like the word disenchantment, and I like the idea of waking up from the enchantment and waking up to the good news that we don't have to cling and grasp to be truly happy, that it's actually in letting go that we become truly happy. And I think that's pretty good news. I think it's also true that becoming disillusioned is also a very good thing, because we realize that that many of our strategies for happiness are not working. It's kind of telling the truth. How's that working for you? Better or worse? And if we want to be happy and we want to treat other people well, it's important to be grounded in reality. And I think that, for me, just to sum up, has been one of the most personally important sources of my faith in the Dharma as practice, because to me it's really grounded in clear seeing. As you know, it's considered that the root cause of suffering in Buddhism, in many ways, is ignorance. It's not understanding correctly. It's not seeing clearly. And it's also true that the ultimate source of complete liberation is insight. It's radically seeing the nature of things. So this is a teaching that's very grounded in truth. And I think that, as a small point, is one reason why Buddhism has had such harmony with science, because science as well, the root of the word science is to know. It's, the Greek roots, the Latin roots of the word science. In much the same way, Buddhism is about knowing the truth. So I'll take my refuge in the truth.
And so insight is inseparable from disillusionment, disenchantment in that sense.
Yeah, that's right. And I think your word disidentification as well. I mean, both in psychology and also in Dharma practice, it's very important to be able to step back from our reactions. I think of our reactions as like a movie inside the mind. And the question is, are you trapped in the movie? Are you glued to the screen, right? Or can you step back, look at it, and go, wow, that's that's unhappy, And that capacity to step back, in psychology it's called the observing ego, or other people talk about the witness, for example, is absolutely fundamental to mental health. Otherwise we're trapped and we're not free. And the first step in freedom in many ways is to step out of the movie and simply observe it for a while.
Some traditionalists would ask if there is not a danger of reducing the Buddhist methods of insight and meditation into neuron signals, to be shut on and off at will with enough training. How do you express or package Neurodharma in a way that is useful to psychiatrists, scientists like yourself, but also palatable to those who have traditionally, as you've alluded to before, said that Dharma is bigger than Neurodharma? How do you appease both sides?
Yeah. I think it's an extremely important question, and one that I have a lot of respect for and have tried to find ways to navigate through it. So I'm going to try to respond in a couple of steps here, all right? In the first step, if you think about it as an analogy, if we were to think about animals in a field, all right? So think about, we have mice and bird and hawks, all right? Now, if we want to understand the mice living in a field and the birds that eat them, the hawks that eat them, we can step back and we can observe it in a very gross level. We can look at animal behavior. Great. Now, if we want to go a step further, we could take it down to the level of the cells, the biology, the physiology inside the mice and inside the hawks. That is a different level of analysis. We could take it even further and we could look at the chemical processes in those cells of the mice and the hawks, or we could even go further and take it down to the quantum level of the basic physics of the atoms and the electrons, the quarks, and all that stuff down there, okay? Now, the question is, which level of analysis is useful? Very often, to really understand hawks and mice, you do not need to look at their physiology or their chemistry or the quantum mechanics. You can just analyze it up here. On the other hand, if you want to influence the behavior of the hawks and the mice in the meadow, sometimes it is helpful to understand things at, in a way, a deeper level of analysis. So for me, it's a pragmatic question. I think there are many very important Buddhist themes and practices that neuroscience does not contribute anything to, much like there's much about understanding hawks and mice that knowing about quantum mechanics gives you no useful benefit on the one hand. On the other hand, if you understand more that, for example, to steady the mind, that neurologically it actually helps to have a steady experience of reward, because dopamine is a neurotransmitter that tracks reward, and steady dopamine helps steady the mind. That then can guide you in your practice to realize that it's especially valuable, if you want to steady the mind and deepen shamatha and so forth, to appreciate and be open to the power of reward. It's useful, for example, to do that. Also, it's useful if you understand that positive emotion, ordinary positive emotion, like gratitude or loving kindness, which are both positive emotions, can calm down. They calm down the alarm bell of the brain, the amygdala, to some extent, and therefore help people be less reactive, especially to negative information. If you know something about that, that has practical value, because it then can help you emphasize the place of wholesome positive emotion in terms of calming down aversion, fear and anger, for example. So in some senses, there's practical value. I think it's also true that appreciating that your mental activities are changing your brain for better or worse can support motivation and conviction for practice, especially in the modern age. I think traditionally it was enough that a venerable authority figure said, do this, and okay, I'll do that. But these days, in the modern world especially, I think people need to believe, for people to have faith or conviction, they need to have some evidence for the fruits of practice, which pragmatically is useful. In a perfect world, they would not need any MRI pictures, But in the real world, if we want to help real people who are very busy and have many things to do with their time, to be able to show that their practice actually can change their body, their physical body, their nervous system for the better, that supports conviction. So in a practical way, it's useful. The last thing I'll say about this is that I think sometimes there can be a kind of fear that the Dharma will be corrupted by whatever culture it moves into. But we could say that about all the movements of Buddhism, as it moved out of northern India into Tibet, and then China, and then Japan, and now into the West. I'm sure there were people at each step of the way who said, no, it's being corrupted. And yet if we step back, we see that the truth is strong enough to withstand the culture that it moves into and grows from and uses and benefits from. And I think much the same thing will happen in the meeting between Buddhism and science. And I think that people can, I do at least, have confidence that the Dharma is strong enough, to withstand its meeting with modern science.
And so Neurodharma, compassionate and pragmatic science devoted to the Dharma.
That's true, and useful for every person. That's the whole point. I mean, again, that's what's so striking about the Buddha in his time. He basically taught for Brahmins and untouchables, or the equivalent alike, for householders and monastics, and for men and women as well. He basically said, this is an opportunity for everyone. And so I think to ground the mental practices of Buddhism in an underlying natural frame, of underlying biology, without being reductionistic, but to ground it there, is a way to make Buddhism actually accessible to everybody, not just people who are interested in psychiatry or psychology, for example.